Hello, welcome to Life Matters. I'm Brendan O'Connell. And have you ever done a really joyous interview? Well, I have today. I did one earlier today, and I'm doing another one with our guest who's come all the way from South Portland, Maine to be with us through inclement weather and snow and whatever else there is out there. But we're going to talk about today is her work with Mother Teresa and the dying in the streets of Calcutta, and what was it really like, and what were the conditions that they were operating under, and were they appreciated that they did this kind of work? So welcome back, Susan Conroy.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be with you again.
Well, Susan, tell us a little bit about what was Calcutta like? I mean, we see all these millions of people. How did these deplorable conditions arise?
We go back into history with this, and it really goes back to, like I said, the history books and the partitioning, actually, of separation of Hindus and Muslims back in the 1940s, I want to say, when West Bengal, which is where Calcutta, India is, became primarily Hindu, and the Muslims had to flee to Muslim Pakistan. And when all of that started happening in the 1940s, millions of people, millions of human beings and millions of families were displaced. Mm-hmm. And so the Muslims fled West Bengal and fled Calcutta area to head to Pakistan, and millions of Hindus flooded into the area that was designated for Hindus. And it just caused devastation. Everybody, displaced and uprooted and transplanted with nothing, with whatever you could carry, and that really kind of led into the overwhelming poverty that you see in Calcutta, India. So it has historical roots. It didn't just happen overnight, and it didn't just happen naturally. It was more politically and religiously that this came about. But it was stunning, and as I mentioned in our previous program, I had a professor at college who, when he found out I was going to India, he loves India, and he's very knowledgeable about India, and he coached me on how to prepare. They say that no Westerner can ever be fully prepared for his or her first encounter with India. You can never be prepared for what you're about to see and experience on the streets of Calcutta, no matter what books you read, no matter what documentaries you watch. As a matter of fact, the professor at college advised me to watch a documentary on Calcutta, India, before I showed up on the streets of Calcutta, India, alone to serve the poorest of the poor with Mother Teresa. And he said to me, before you watch that documentary, I recommend that you have a couple of stiff drinks. It's very disturbing, it's very upsetting, so it's rough. It was rough, and it was shocking. And when I first started walking on the streets of Calcutta, setting out to find Mother Teresa and then to help her serve the lepers, help her serve the mentally ill, help her serve the orphans, the unwanted babies and children, help her serve the sick and the dying. I remember walking through the streets of Calcutta and seeing such disfigured and mutilated bodies of human beings and such poverty, such agony, such suffering in the streets of Calcutta, that I kept saying to myself, this is like hell on earth. And I kept thinking, I hope there's nowhere else on the face of this planet that's worse than what I'm witnessing here on the streets of Calcutta, because I couldn't believe it. And I actually tried to refrain during my first several weeks and couple of months, for the most part, refrain from taking photographs, because everything my first days walking the streets was so shocking, I would have used up all my film. Whoa, that's shocking. So I deliberately tried to just go, you're on a mission of love, to serve, to love and to serve, and just acclimate yourself to the streets of Calcutta and to the conditions and to the people. And then later, at the end of the first summer, then take your pictures of the most common sights. But even the photographs can't fully describe the smells and the sounds. Every sense is bombarded, overwhelmed with the most putrid sights, sounds, smells, and experiences.
Now, we have a picture, I believe, or two of Calcutta. Perhaps we could get that up on screen. Now, what is this particular?
I would walk these streets of Calcutta every single day on the way from my little hotel room through the city streets to find Mother Teresa's house, her convent. I went to Mass every morning to pray with the sisters. Then I served in the orphanage. Then I was back out on the streets. And then I would serve in the home for the dying. But daily I was walking through these streets on my way to the different shelters for the poorest of the poor and on my way to Mother Teresa's house. So can you imagine Susan from South Portland, Maine, walking through these streets looking for something to eat?
And how about here?
This is just outside Mother Teresa's famous home for the dying. And this is where I volunteered every single afternoon during my visits in Calcutta, India. In the background, you can see the ambulance. And I had the beautiful privilege.
Is the ambulance the blue vehicle?
Exactly. And I had the beautiful privilege of riding in the back of Mother Teresa's ambulance every single day from the orphanage through the city streets to the home for the dying. And what would happen is people on the streets, when they saw Mother Teresa's ambulance coming along, they'd flag us down if they felt someone was in agony in the gutter. They'd wave us down if they felt someone was about to die on the sidewalk. And we'd pull over in the ambulance, open up the back, and lift the body of that man, that woman, or that child off the streets with our own hands and bring them onto the ambulance and transport them to the home for the dying, where we would bathe them and care for them, give them a bed and a pillow and food and drink and love, and care for them all the way. But it was really stunning. I think one of the things that I find that a lot of people don't understand about what Mother Teresa was doing here is, first of all, this isn't a hospital. You know, there are hospitals in Calcutta, India. This that she started is a home for the dying, because when she first started ministering to the poorest of the poor, you know, the sick, the dying, on the streets of Calcutta, one of the first human beings that Mother Teresa lifted out of the gutters was so deathly ill, and she carried that person to a hospital. They wouldn't take her because the person was untouchable and poor, desperately poor, and didn't have money to pay for care. And it was so painful for Mother Teresa to have all these people in need of care and love and shelter and basic human dignity, and yet be sent away from a hospital because they didn't have money to pay, that she wanted to find a shelter where she could bring the dying people from the streets of Calcutta. What's stunning to me is her shelter is a home for the dying, people at the very end of their life that we lifted up out of gutters. If Mother Teresa was not doing what she was doing, if Mother Teresa had not been called by our Lord himself to minister, you know, in the black hole of Calcutta, as it's historically called, you know, in the slums and among the poorest of the poor in Calcutta, tens of thousands of human beings would be left alone, to die in the gutters alone, eaten by rats literally this big. You know,
rats would eat them?
The rats were huge. The rats were eating. People with leprosy on the streets of Calcutta, you always could recognize a leper on the streets of Calcutta, because one of the things about leprosy is you can't feel it if you're asleep on the gutter and a rat is eating at your finger all night. You can't feel it. You know, that's the problem. That's why lepers lose their fingers and toes and limbs, is because, you know, if they're being burnt, they can't feel it. They lose that sensitivity. We would pull our hand away if we felt something gnawing on our hand or our foot, or if we felt the heat of a flame. But leprosy, you know, they're not able to feel that, and so they become mutilated, really. But literally, if Mother Teresa was not lifting people out of gutters, people would be dying alone in gutters, alone on the sidewalks of Calcutta, eaten by rats. That is exactly what has happened. And so I kept praising God and thanking God that Mother Teresa was doing what she was doing, because I thought each person that we're loving and caring for would be dying alone in agony on the streets. And now they're loved. Mother Teresa's dream for every single human being in the home for the dying was that each one would die at peace with God and in sight of a loving face. That was her dream in the home for the dying, that each and every individual would die at peace with God and in sight of a loving face. And I can tell you, I have never seen such profound gratitude as I saw in the men who looked back up at me as I was feeding them their last meals or holding their hand during their final hours. The gratitude would make you cry. These were considered truly the untouchables of society. And I can tell you as a first-hand witness that there are people on the streets of Calcutta that the human beings walk over their bodies or walk around their bodies or walk on the other side of the street for fear of the dirt, the germs, the disease, for fear of catching something. People don't usually go near the untouchables. And yet here comes Mother Teresa and the Missionaries of Charity with love greater than fear, touching the untouchables and lifting them up and bathing them with our own hands. We bathed the people from the streets. With our own hands, we cleaned the maggots out of the open sores of the poorest of the poor. No one else wanted to do this work. And so the people themselves realized they were the untouchables. The people themselves realized no one wanted to come near them. And all of a sudden, we're touching them. We're loving them. We care about them. We're feeding them. We're staying with them in their final hours. And I just, again, to see the gratitude of the men in the home for the dying look up at us and try to say thank you, to try to nod their head in appreciation and gratitude, that was all the compensation I needed as a volunteer, was the profound gratitude, especially of the men in the Home for the Dying. There was a men's section and a women's section, and I'll tell you quite honestly that I learned years ago that in this particular shelter, in the Home for the Dying, the men die faster, the women seem to linger. I don't know why that is, but when I learned that the men die faster, I resolved to work with the men. I want to work with the men because their time is shorter, it seems, and so I really want to love them and care for them and be with them and help them through their final hours and their final days. But
and yet they're speaking Bengali or another language, and you're speaking English. How can you communicate?
I'm telling you, when someone is at the end of his life, especially males, they don't want to do a lot of talking. They're not conversational, but they loved the love and they loved the care, and they were so grateful for the glass of water. When they were thirsty, we brought him a glass of cold water. If I found a man shivering in his bed, I brought him a blanket. If someone was hungry, I fed him. If someone could no longer eat, I stayed with him, holding his hand or rubbing his feet. You know, whatever I could to give comfort, to give peace, to give love, and to let him know, I always wanted someone to be with each one when they were dying. I wanted someone to be with them to be able to say, don't be afraid, I'm right here with you. And even if that man or woman didn't understand English, they would all understand love. And they would all understand that they weren't alone in their final misery and that someone cared. So the English didn't matter, and I call it the universal language of love, that love is understood everywhere you go in the world. And, it's my grandfather from Ireland, here we are in Boston area, a lot of Irish, and my grandpa came from Ireland, and he used to say that words are cheap, words are cheap. Don't say you love someone, show it. Mother Teresa used to say, love proves itself 1,000 times a day. Show that dying man you love him. Show that leper you love him. Don't say I love you and do nothing. Words are cheap, like Grandpa said, like my Irish grandpa said.
Well, now, didn't you tell me that the conditions were really deplorable? For instance, drinking water over there in Calcutta. You said you had to boil water and there were elements in there. And what was that?
That's a nice way to put it. There were elements in there. That's very kind. During my first summer in Calcutta, India, I could not find one single glass of fresh, clean water. The water was so contaminated, you could see the organisms swimming around in it. And you would have to boil the water for at least 20 minutes to kill off the bugs, to kill off the organisms. And then I also used water purification tablets to kill off the bugs, just to make sure they were dead. But then you had to drink it. And you were drinking a glass full of dead bugs, and it was horrifying to me. And throughout that first summer in India, I kept having flashbacks. What's it like back home in the United States? What's it like back home in New England? What's it like back home in Maine? And I thought, wow, back home in Maine, I can drink all the fresh, clean water I want, right from the tap. I drink glass after glass of pure, clean water. And we bathe ourselves in tubfuls of fresh, clean water, and we cook our meals in big containers of pure water. Here in America, here in New England, we even water our grass and our flowers with pure water. But in Calcutta, I couldn't find one single glass of fresh, clean water when I was thirsty to drink. And I share with people that this experience in Calcutta gave me what I call an attitude of gratitude. I cannot thank and praise God enough for all the wonderful blessings we have here in America. Millions of blessings. And I'll share another one, not only fresh water, but in Maine, we're called the pine tree state, and full of pine trees. And I live within walking distance of the ocean. And you can smell when you step out the fresh cut grass, or the hyacinth are blooming, or the lilacs in bloom, or the smell of the salt air of the sea, or the pine trees. I love when I'm home in New England, home in Maine, to breathe deeply because it's awesome, beautiful smells, natural smells. Calcutta, I was in torture. The pollution was so dense, the smoke and the soot and the pollution was so dense, I thought I'd come home with severe respiratory problems. I was struggling to breathe by the end of my first summer in Calcutta. There were bed bugs. There were lizards this long climbing on the walls. Every night the lizards would come out on the walls. And there were bed bugs in the beds. There were lizards on the walls. There were rats this big on the street. And after the floods would subside, you'd see big dead rats. And it was horrifying to me. I'm a woman. I don't like bugs, as I say. I'm not like St. Francis of Assisi. I don't like bugs. I draw the line with bugs. And I even shared recently I was in my little cot in Calcutta where I was staying, and a lizard went right over my hand in my bed, a lizard in the bed. So it was rough. I kept telling myself during my experiences in Calcutta.
Did you say something to the lizard like, how dare you?
Well, at first I was horrified of the lizards until one of the other volunteers there in Calcutta said, "Don't worry, Susan, the lizards eat the cockroaches. They eat the bugs." And it's like, okay, lizards are now my friends. They eat the bugs. But, I kept thinking to myself while I was in Calcutta each time, I kept saying, "Susan, you're not on vacation. You're not on vacation. If you were on vacation, this would be the most miserable vacation of your life. You're here to serve the poorest of the poor. You're here to serve the lepers, the dying, the sick, and the destitute." And this goes all along with it. When you're trying to serve those who are in most misery, you're going to suffer a little misery too. You've got a little hardship to endure if you're there to serve, really there to serve. And so I had to keep reminding myself, you're not on vacation, you're not on vacation. And that helped me to be strong and to deal with it and to walk through the floods and avoid the rats and let the lizards run across my hand.
And do we have any other pictures, photos that would
I think at the beginning there's the Home for the Dying. This is the men's section of the Home for the Dying, and the men who are closest to the front were the most critically ill, and so these are the ones we focused on the most because they were most critically ill, and right under our gaze where we tended to them most. And it was awesome, I have to say. What a privilege to serve. I felt so honored to serve the men in the Home for the Dying. And I'm going to say something that might sound a little bit shocking to you. But as I cared for these men, one after another in the Home for the Dying, I actually prayed, "Dear God, please may I be more like these men." Because they were so inspiring to me, these dying men. They were so humble and so gentle and so grateful and so virtuous, had so much inner strength. And I want to be like that. They really inspired me. Who would believe that someone could pray to be like the men in the Home for the Dying? Now, no one wants to suffer, so I didn't pray for the sufferer. I don't want to suffer, although we all have our cross to bear, don't we? We all have our suffering, but the virtue. They were awesome in virtue. And Mother Teresa, we just saw a glimpse of Mother Teresa a moment ago, and I took that picture of Mother Teresa in the Home for the Dying, and she was known throughout the world as a living saint. And even the most secular newspapers and magazines would put her photograph on the cover and put living saint. That even the most secular publications would acknowledge genuine compassion when they saw it and genuine holiness when they saw it. When I watched Mother Teresa every day while we were together in Calcutta, I watched her shining her love on others, on the poor, on the orphans, on the sick, the suffering, on myself. She just was loving us all and treating us all like gold. She treated us all like gold. And I started saying, not only is she a living saint, I called Mother Teresa a living prayer. Because I could see firsthand every day, Mother Teresa didn't just say her prayers to God. Mother Teresa didn't just pay lip service to God. She lived her prayers. She embodied her prayers. She put them into action. She put her love into living action. And that's what she taught us all to do.
Wow, that's really something. Now, how about the next picture?
This is actually a woman, 40-year-old woman named Miriam in the women's section of the Home for the Dying. And I became friends with Miriam not only because her wonderful personality. Every time I sat at Miriam's bedside, she'd swing her arm up over my lap and she'd let me rub her shaven head or rub her feet. And she taught me how to say balavasi, which means I love you. And I'd always get her some high-protein biscuits. We became friends also because she lived throughout the summer that I was there, the first summer I was there. And a lot of patients didn't. They were near the end. But Miriam did live, and we became close. Yeah.
And next?
This is actually the same patient. That's the 40-year-old Miriam dying of tuberculosis. And this picture always reminds me of how Mother Teresa used to say that the greatest disease in the world today is not tuberculosis, it's not AIDS, it's not leprosy, it's not cancer. She insisted the greatest disease in the world today, in her eyes, was being unloved and uncared for and unwanted and being rejected by everybody and loneliness. She felt loneliness is the greatest disease in the world today, and she said you can find this disease everywhere in the world you go, even in your own home and in your own family sometimes. And she'd challenge us, find them, put your love for them into living action, become a channel of God's peace right where you are in the world. Yeah.
Wow, that's really something. And how about this photo here?
This photo reminds me, each one calls to mind my experience at those moments, and this one reminds me of death in the Home for the Dying, because that's what this was, a shelter for the dying. We were not, most of these patients that we lifted out of the gutters of Calcutta, they were beyond being restored to health. We weren't going to cure them at this point, but we were going to love them and care for them and give them whatever human dignity and compassion and care we could during the final hours and final days of their life. And so they were beyond restoring to health for the most part. Sometimes we could nurse someone back to health. We did give medicine. We did give comfort as best we could. We gave food. We gave nourishment, everything we could. But I, as a 21-year-old, when I first showed up on the streets of Calcutta, quite honestly, I had never seen anybody die before. And yet Mother Teresa allowed me to hold people and take care of people even as they breathed their last breath, because she knew that I had hands to serve and a heart to love. And I had what she called a joyful willingness to do even the most humble work for the poor, the sick, and the dying. And so she allowed me to take care of people even at their end of their life. Sometimes when they were too emaciated even to be fed, the doctors and nurses would put tubes through their nostrils to give them nourishing fluid to sustain them. One of the dying men in the Home for the Dying actually looked up at Mother Teresa and said, "All my life I've lived like an animal on the streets, but here I'm dying like an angel because I'm loved, I'm cared for." Keep in mind, these are considered the untouchables of society. No one even went near them. No one touched them. No one helped them. And all of a sudden comes along Mother Teresa and her sisters loving and serving. And it bowled them over with gratitude. Like, you care? Yes, we care. Why are you doing this? Because we love you. Very powerful, the power of love.
Now, I noticed there was a photo up there of the orphanage, it looked like, some pictures that you were drawing. You're an artist also, among your being a writer, an artist, you've got many talents. Might we see this photo here? What is this all about?
Mother Teresa herself gave me permission to do some artwork for her personally, as well as in the children's orphanage, and some artwork in the Home for the Dying. But in the children's orphanage in particular, that's where this photograph was taken, Mother Teresa allowed me to transform the children's orphanage and to paint murals along the walls. And I'm going to tell you a nice thing about the Americans that were in Calcutta is when the Americans in the American consulate in Calcutta, India, found out that there was an American volunteer named Susan Conroy who was willing to paint the walls of Mother Teresa's orphanage, her children's home. They said, if she's willing to do all the work, we're going to help her. And they paid for everything. The Americans that were living in Calcutta at the time, working at the American consulate, they paid for all the paintbrushes, all the paint. I did all the labor, but I didn't have to pay a penny for it. I just did the labor. And they sent in 2 Indian men to plaster all the holes in the walls, to sand down the rough spots. And the Indian men painted bright blue all around the walls. And I started painting what I called my number train, with the 10 puffs of smoke and the 9 bumblebees and 8 raindrops, right down to the number 1 caboose. And in the next slide, you can see how I painted the ABCs along the walls where the children took their naps, right here. So you could see the children in their cribs. And that's what I painted. Mother Teresa allowed me to paint the ABCs to really to educate the children and to cheer them up. And what was awesome about this experience of painting the walls of Mother Teresa's children's home is that as the walls came to life, the children came to life. And so as I was painting, a little orphan boy would come up and pull at my sleeve and say, "Auntie, Auntie," and he'd show me how he could count the 10 puffs of smoke. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then another little boy come up and say, "Auntie, Auntie," and he'd go, "Choo, choo, 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 choo." As I was painting the ABCs, A for apple, B for bear and balloon, C for child, and so on, I was quietly painting during nap time, and I could hear a little girl behind me, and I turned, looked over my shoulder, and I could see a little tiny child in her crib singing A, B, C, D. And so that warmed my heart to see, again, the children had something to do now, something to stimulate them, something to educate them, and to cheer up their home, their children's home.
And that last photograph was you at a wishing well or something?
It looks like it, but it's actually on the roof of the Home for the Dying. That Sister Luke found out that I was doing artwork for Mother Teresa and also painting the walls of the orphanage, and Sister Luke brought me up to the roof of the Home for the Dying and asked me to repaint this portrait of Mother Teresa with a prayer that said, "Be with Mother through life's journey," a prayer asking God to bless and watch over Mother Teresa as she traveled around the world on her missions of love. And this is one of the very few slides where you see Susan is not smiling. I was very nervous painting Mother Teresa's face, and as I've shared before, it's one thing to mess up the ABCs, but it's another thing to mess up Mother Teresa's face.
Tell us about that one picture. I think here it is here, where she has on the hand, she wrote something, she took you up painting, and she started, what did she do?
Well, Mother Teresa, first of all, asked me to make this drawing that I'm holding in my hand in this particular photograph. That's Susan Conroy with Mother Teresa in Calcutta at the Mother House where Mother Teresa lived. That was her headquarters in the world. She asked me to draw this picture of a little child in the palm of God's hand. That was all her idea. She commissioned me to draw this, and she also wanted me to write these words that God speaks to every single one of us through the prophet Isaiah. She loves these words. God says to us this, "See, I will not forget you. I have carved you on the palm of my hand. I have called you by your name. You are mine. You are precious to me. I love you." And Mother Teresa would actually take this picture of a child in God's hand and show people and say, "Do you see this little child in God's hand? This child is you. This is how precious you are to God. It's like you're his only child, and he's carrying you through life and protecting you and guiding you." And but what you're alluding to here is that I did the drawing for Mother Teresa. I put my whole heart into it, the child in God's hand and the words that God says to us through the prophet Isaiah. And I went to show Mother Teresa the drawing to say, "Is it okay? Do you want me to make any changes to the drawing before I have it framed and put under glass? I can't change it once it's under glass." So I sat on a little bench outside Mother Teresa's office at the Mother House, showed her the pictures, and I'll never in my life forget. Mother Teresa took the picture of the child in God's hand out of my hands, and then she took the pencil out of my hands and she started writing on my drawing.
What?
And yeah, it's exactly what my sense was. What is she doing? She's going to ruin my picture. It was my first reaction, but I didn't say that out loud. Within seconds, I came to my senses and I said, "Susan, this is Mother Teresa. And even if she scribbles all over your artwork, it's okay. It's Mother Teresa. Go ahead, Mother, whatever you want to put on the drawing." And I was so profoundly touched by what Mother Teresa wrote on this drawing. Let me preface this, if I may, by saying the whole inspiration for her work among the poorest of the poor, the abandoned, the unwanted babies, the sick and the dying and the lepers, the lonely, the poor, the inspiration for serving them and loving them with all her heart and soul was what Jesus Christ himself said. And she reminded us repeatedly, what she was doing was not social work. She was not doing it for something. She's doing it to someone, and that someone's name is our Lord Jesus. And she said, Jesus told us, "Whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers, you do unto me. When I was hungry, you gave me to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. Homeless, you took me in. When I was sick or in prison, you visited me." And then our Lord said, "Now enter into the home of my Father." That was me you were serving. Well, one day I was in Mother Teresa's house, and she said, "Whenever you visit and reach out to anyone who's suffering, lonely, poor, in misery, always remember these 5 words that Jesus said, 'You did it to me.' And go about visiting and loving and helping each one with all the tenderness and respect and humility and compassion with which you would love and serve Jesus Christ himself. Because in serving those who are suffering and miserable, you're directly serving God. He said so. Whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers, you did it to me." So what she wrote on the drawing that she asked me to draw on the fingers of God's hand, she wrote, "You did it to me." And I was so touched. That drawing became so precious to me.
Wow, that's really something. And do you have a copy of that, or do you have the original? Or?
I'm kind of humbled to say that after Mother Teresa drew on this picture that she asked me to draw, it became so precious to me that I kept it. And after the book got released, Mother Teresa's Lessons of Love and Secrets of Sanctity, people all across the country said, "Can we get a copy of that drawing? Can we get a copy of it?" with Mother Teresa's own writing on it. So I made very high quality reproductions of that original image. So that's her writing on the fingers of God's hand.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Susan, so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. There's so much more that you could talk about.
We could keep going, right?
Yeah. We may have to do that after the show. But we really appreciate you coming all the way from South Portland, Maine, and sharing us what your experience was with Mother Teresa, who's going to be a saint pretty soon, I believe. Well, folks, we hope you enjoyed today's show and found it to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.